Thank you. Right. So thanks very much for all of you for being here, and to our organizers for putting together what's already been a lovely conference, a Guidelines Challenge, Philosophy, Practice, and Policy. Today I'll be talking to you about manageable mechanisms in medicine, or how confounders make amalgamation difficult. Question. Okay, so what's the big question for this talk? It looks like, from what I heard this morning, it looks like those who make guidelines are interested in at least some kind of place for knowledge that comes from mechanisms in that process of creating guidelines. It's not clear how that's going to work with their guideline creation process. It's not clear how enthusiastic they might be about that kind of knowledge as compared to more traditional kinds of knowledge that show up in guidelines like randomized controlled trials, but there's an interest. I think that's fair to say from what I heard this morning. Great. Big question, can we use mechanisms this way? It's an important question. But I think before we can even get to that question, there's a first question, a more fundamental question, a worry about how mechanisms work at all. So this worry is this bottom question that I'm going to focus on. How much do you need to know to use a mechanism at all? Does this knowledge need to include all confounders? Only some confounders? And the big question, how big, quote unquote, are mechanisms? Right, so we've got lots of vocabulary in that needs to be fleshed out. But just briefly, what are the problems here? Okay, so the main problems here are disagreement about what I call the size of mechanisms, the scope of mechanisms. And I argue in other places that restricting the size of mechanisms can make them a more palatable alternative, a better option, or for a different alternative to randomized controlled trial type evidence, or at least an amalgamation to EBM or hierarchical approaches in guideline creation. Okay, so one issue is about the size of mechanisms and the way in which they're not very palatable, given their sometimes thought to be immense size as an alternative. And then the second problem is about how these differences in the concept of the size of mechanisms can make them harder than they need to be to compare and assess between different kinds of mechanisms. So if you wanted to do a project that assessed the quality of mechanisms, if you're not sure what mechanisms exactly need to include, it's going to be difficult to do that assessment of quality in a way that's consistent across different projects. Okay. So first, let's back up. We got kind of far there without saying what is a mechanism. Okay, so the philosophers in the room here know we could do a whole conference, we could do a whole book, we could do a whole lifetime of work on what exactly a mechanism is and how exactly it is that causality is supposed to work. It's several people in this room's life work. But let's start with just a popular definition is the McNamara, Darden, and Craver definition given in their seminal 2000 paper. So they write, mechanisms are entities and activities organized such that they're productive of regular changes from startup or setup to finish or termination conditions. Okay, so that's one popular definition, and it's worth at least getting something on the table to consider as a definition of a mechanism. But what's kind of strange is, at least in the literature I'm looking at to talk about these worries about the size of mechanisms, the scope of mechanisms, there's a lot of talk about how it doesn't really matter too much which philosophical definition of mechanism we go with, right? So, at least in this set of literature, one of the components that I'm going to talk about in the debate I'm going to talk about are the papers done by Russo and Williamson, one of whom is here. So they write in this paper exactly what constitutes such mechanisms will not concern us here. We've got a list of some possibilities. Okay, so you have to list a couple of possibilities. Some view mechanisms to be processes transmitting conserved physical quantities. Okay, that's one option. Others claim that mechanisms are composed of chains of probabilistic or counterfactual dependencies. Still others say that they're composed of chains of theoretical explanations. So we've got at least 3 different definitions of mechanism here. But they say for what they're up to, any of that will work. And the other side of the debate I'm talking about here, about the scope and size of mechanisms, says a similar kind of thing. So a problem, Jeremy Hoek says, a problem with exploring how mechanisms provide evidence is that mechanism has been recently characterized in several ways. So he identifies this problem as well, but then says, he identifies several of the same the same philosophical possibilities that Rousseau and Williamson offer, and then suggest that for present purposes, these definitions are sufficiently similar. So it's important in some sense what mechanisms mean, but in the debate I'm talking about, lots of the different meanings are considered to be acceptable. Okay, so one of the pieces of vocab we needed to understand the problems and the question that I'm talking about today was a mechanism. Another one was a confounder. Okay, so in what I'm talking about today, what a confounder is some kind of intervening force on a mechanism. In other work with this group, I've talked about confounders in terms of unlesses, right? Okay, so the famous philosophical example, so striking a match produces a flame. That's kind of mechanism. Unless there's no oxygen in the room. That's one kind of unless. Unless the matches are underwater. Unless you don't know how to use matches and you've turned it around backwards and you're trying to strike a match with the side that doesn't have any yet. So unless you don't know how to use matches, right? So these different unlesses are what I mean when I talk about what is a confounder. Okay? Right. So I want to note here that you can see in guidelines that they already care about these kind of confounders. It's already an important part of how guidelines work, is that they try to take into account some of these confounders. Okay. So an example, so this is from a NICE guideline that came out really quite recently, September 2017, NICE guideline called Faltering Growth, Recognition and Management of Faltering Growth in Children. Okay, so this is about sort of weight loss in children soon after birth. So sometimes there might be reason for concern about weight loss in the early days of life, and we might need to assess and intervene on those situations. That's sort of standard Generally, if there's weight loss, we should perhaps be worried and may need to intervene. But unless, if possible, obtain the biological parent's heights and work out the mid-parental height centile. Okay, so unless you know that, for example, both parents are of very short stature, and you should expect this child to already be somewhat below the weight, that's kind of what we would expect, you should intervene. So you should intervene unless you have this particular situation, this particular confounder that we already know about, that we already know how to deal with. So it's the case that guidelines are already interested in, they're already making note of, they're already working with the concept of confounders. Okay. So let's get, now that we've done our vocab, we've talked about what mechanisms might mean, or whether it matters what mechanisms mean. We've talked about what confounders are. Let's get down to the brass tacks. What's the debate I'm talking about? Okay, so on one side, we have the Rousseau-Williamson thesis. Rousseau and Williamson argue that only together can probabilistic relations and mechanisms help us to make causal claims which allow health professionals to make decisions about interventions. Okay, so they write, we argue that the health sciences make causal claims on the basis of evidence both of physical mechanisms and of probabilistic dependencies. That's the kind of evidence you get from randomized controlled trials. Okay, consequently, an analysis of causality solely in terms of physical mechanisms or solely in terms of probabilistic relationships does not do justice to the causal claims of these sciences. So you need both, they claim, in order to make these kind of causal claims. Why do you need both? You need both because both mechanisms and probabilistic relations have sort of downsides, have frailties, have drawbacks that the other can usefully compensate for. So in mechanisms, they're worried about the possibility that the purported cause might be prior to the effect, and it might be mechanistically connected to it, but it doesn't actually make much difference. So the example here is that barometer readings don't cause storms, changes in barometer readings don't cause storms, but you might not know that if you're using just a solely mechanistic model. The example for probabilistic relations is the worry that it can mistake correlation for causation, and that mechanistic models can assist with that. So the idea is that these are mutually supporting methods and that you need both. Okay. So in challenging this thesis, there's a lot of different ways people challenge this thesis. One of the challenges to it came from Jeremy Hoek, who wrote that there were two problems with the Rousseau-Williamson thesis, and they both had to do with difficulties with mechanisms. Okay, so one was that mechanisms are difficult to correctly identify. And he argued this by pointing to times in the past where we've not gotten our mechanisms correct. So his examples were bloodletting, placing babies to sleep on their stomach, antiarrhythmic drugs, many others. So he's offering an explanation via historical example. We've done a bad job in the past correctly identifying mechanisms. We should be worried about that as an important component of justifying causal claims. The other worry he has is that it's difficult to predict how mechanisms will behave under intervention. So by this he means something like in the wild, right? So we have our mechanism that we've gotten from our bench science, but in the wild things don't always go to plan. So he takes as important in these kind of cases where a particular drug could either alleviate or aggravate a particular disorder depending on the environment or the clinical case in mind. So he talks a lot about the ways in which interventions for depression sometimes alleviate and sometimes aggravate the symptoms they're meant to deal with. So both of these worries have something in common. I think that what they have in common is worries about the size of mechanisms. So he illustrates this. This is his figure 3 from the Exposing the Vanities paper in 2011. He labels it a small extract of mechanism for metabolism. It's kind of hard to read. I made it as big as I could, but that's kind of the point, right? The point is that you can't read it. The point is there's so much going on. How could you even start? And so much of it we don't really understand. And this is an important component of so many different interventions, right? So metabolism matters for a great many of the interventions we depend on. If we can't make causal claims without understanding all the components of this, we are in deep trouble. That's a deeply flawed sort of theory if that has that requirement. And I think sometimes the literature might make it seem as if Jeremy Hoek is the only one who's concerned about this, but that's not the case. For example, when Darden from the MDC, the mechanism definition I gave earlier, when Darden presented her diagram similar to this, of a biological mechanism that she's currently working with some biologists to try to figure out how this mechanism works. It has a couple of black boxes. The first question she gets is, how worried should you be about how many black boxes you have? It's a common sense kind of worry. How much knowledge do you need in order for this to be a useful exercise at all is a sort of common sense worry, and I don't think Jeremy Hoek is alone in being concerned about this. Okay. So what's the problem here? I say that the problem here is that the two sides see the size of mechanisms very differently. Okay. What does that mean? So for the Russo-Williamson group, mechanisms are easy to point to. They're of unproblematic size. We know what we mean when we talk about mechanisms. Yeah. We say, like, when you strike a match, you get a flame. They're pretty simple things that we can talk about. We know what they are. They're of a manageable size. For Hoek and others in the EVM community, mechanisms can be very large. That is, in order to have knowledge that's useful from a mechanism, you're going to need to understand all possible confounders, right? So that's not just when you strike a match, you get a flame. That's also all those bits about, and there needs to be oxygen in the room, and there needs to be not underwater, and you need to know how to use a match, right? So all of that makes for a really big epistemic burden, right? Making a list of all those is just a lot of work. And that's just 3. I'm sure you can think of other reasons that matches wouldn't make flames. So for Hoek and others in the EVM community, mechanisms are big. So the difference, I think, between the two groups has to do with the size of mechanisms. How hard you have to work, how many confounders you need to include before mechanisms are useful, interesting, worth working on. Okay, so what can we do about this? Well, I think a good first start, and parties that I'm talking about here today and other work are sometimes, but being much more clear about exactly what a mechanism is. This might be pretty difficult and time-consuming, given that there's lots of accounts on offer, right? So sorting through all these is going to be pretty difficult. That's a heavy investment solution to the problem. A lighter investment solution, I mean, I think we pretty much have to do that one, but A lighter investment might just be to stipulate that mechanisms do not need to contain information about all possible confounders. Okay? So part of the reason that this might be a legitimate thing to do is the reason that we were worried about all possible confounders in the first place. So knowing all possible confounders is only proposed as required for mechanisms so that they're as good as randomized controlled trials, so they can compete as a knowledge base with randomized controlled trials. And this is because randomized controlled trials are thought to control for all possible confounders, known and unknown, through the process of randomization. If they don't, and we might have good reason to think they don't, then this bar is set high for mechanisms for an unjustified reason, in an unjustified manner. So what can we do? Be more clear about what a mechanism is, or we could just stipulate that mechanisms, whichever kind of mechanisms you like, do not need to contain information about all possible confounders. Okay, so let's bring this back. So what does all of this mean for amalgamation? Okay, two big takeaways. What does this mean for bringing different kinds of evidence together, the kind of thing you'd be interested in doing if you're interested in making guidelines? One of the things it'll mean is that because the size problem, the scope problem for mechanisms makes their use kind of uncertain, people are concerned about how much do I need to know, how much work is this going to be. Addressing the confusion can open possibilities for mixed methods type of evidence amalgamation. It can seem more legitimate to say, I want to talk about all the evidence that's involved, the randomized controlled trials and the mechanisms, if you're not worried that mechanisms are unduly weighty, impossible to get proper knowledge of, require you to know all possible confounders. So it makes this mixed method approach of amalgamation seem much more plausible if we can fix this size problem. The other issue is that if we were, without addressing this size problem, if we were to try to compare different mechanisms to try to assess them for quality, which I think is part of what you're going to talk about. If we were going to try to do that without dealing with this size, the scope problem, the mechanisms we're talking about are going to have really different levels of detail, and they're going to take really different amounts of time to produce, right? So some of them you could say, well, we already have that from our bench science, but if you have a really large conception of the scope of mechanisms, it's going to be a while. We're going to be here a long time before we figure out the mechanism that you're talking about. Okay. What does this mean for guidelines? Philosophy might help sort this out. Yay, we might be good for something. Okay. Okay. In addition to that sort of inside joke, mechanisms might also play a greater role in guideline development if we can fix this problem, and other parts of healthcare practice in the future. And this would be much easier to achieve if the mechanisms we're interested in are not quite so large. So a working paper on this, if you're interested, let me know. I'd be very glad to talk about this. Still working on it. So send me an email if you're interested in that. There's some selected sources. I'm on Twitter. It's a lot of fun. Please tweet me. Thanks very much. Have a good day.